Hello, Civicsers. Hannah here. You're about to hear a very special new thing from us here at Civics 101. We're calling it Ask Civics, where we take a few minutes to directly answer your questions about this democratic republic. Speaking of, that's exactly what this premiere episode is about. What exactly are we? Are we a democracy? A republic? What does that even mean? It's a question that we have been asked a few times over the years. We've even been told that Civics 101 can't be a show about the way that our democracy works because the US isn't a democracy to begin with. Well, is that true? Let's clear this up. This is a recurring segment that airs on New Hampshire Public Radio and will be appearing regularly in this podcast feed. Our pal Peter Biello is joining us on this journey through civics queries. Here we go.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Peter. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. So the question is, what are we? We call America a democracy, but that doesn't quite tell the whole story, does it?
That's right. You know, when we first started hosting the show, Nick Capodice and I, we had a tagline that basically said, we are a show about the basics of how democracy works. And we would have listeners write in and say, well, we're not really a democracy. We are a republic. And so we kept asking our guests, well, is that true? Are these listeners correct? You know, what is the intention and operation of our government? And the answer, Peter, is that we are both.
We are both. Okay. And how did it get this way?
Great question. I think you can fairly say that people, when they say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, make that critique with good reason. Democracy in its purest form, its most direct form, means that citizens make decisions about the way their lives and their government are run without any go-between. And that is actually closer to how we started out within our original Constitution.
So how did things evolve to the point where they are now?
So our original Constitution, Peter, was the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution that we have today is actually our second Constitution. And in the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch, and Congress only had the powers, quote, expressly delegated to it by the states. And our country did not fare so well under that Constitution. There wasn't a strong enough federal government, and the states, the people, had a little too much power. It meant that Congress couldn't tax anybody. We fell into a recession. Rebellions began to crop up. So the way that we got to the form of government that we have today is that our framers met in 1787 in Philadelphia to correct what they called an excess of democracy. And I'm going to let one of our former guests, Woody Holton, a professor at the University of South Carolina, explain what that means.
That phrase, excess of democracy, the problem we're solving here is excess of democracy, was used both by Hamilton, who's going to end up writing most of the Federalist Papers, so he's on one end of the spectrum, and by Elbridge Gerry, who's on the opposite end of the spectrum in that he opposed the Constitution. And so there was this consensus at the Constitutional Convention between both extremes and everybody in between that the number one reason that the framers went to Philadelphia to what we now call Constitution Hall to write the Constitution in the summer of 1787 was to make the United States a less democratic place.
So essentially he's saying we became less democratic but more functional as a large country or a growing country.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because the issues with the Articles of Confederation, well, one of the issues was that too much power was in the hands of the people. And while the framers had no intention of creating a monarch, they did create this stronger federal government. They created an executive. And very importantly, if we're going to think about democracy as the way that the people make decisions, they created a barrier between the masses and the presidential vote in the form of the Electoral College. But I think that still begs the question, what does that mean, Peter, for what we are? And as I said, we've asked that of a lot of guests on our show, and I feel like Rebecca Dean, she's a professor at the University of Texas at Arlington, had one of the clearest answers.
So we're a democratic republic is what we are. We are definitely a republic in the sense that we do not have direct democracy on a large scale, certainly not at the national level.
At the national level, we have people we elect, and they make the decisions for us. So that's what makes us what we are, not quite a pure democracy, but a democratic republic.
Exactly. And, direct democracy does exist in the U.S. in the form of small towns and town meetings where every eligible voter in town gets to say, for example, whether or not a stop sign goes up at a certain corner. But that only works at a very small scale level.
And so overall, if I can summarize your thoughts, Hannah, it seems like we can describe ourselves fairly as a democratic republic, and it seems like it's very important to maintain that word democracy in how we describe ourselves.
Exactly. And the reason that it's important to maintain this label of democracy is because that was still the guiding philosophy that the framers were committed to when they were writing the Constitution, despite the fact that they created it in part to reel the power of the people back. It was still essential that decision-making power be in some way vested in the people.
Hannah McCarthy is co-host of Civics 101, a podcast produced by NHPR about how our democracy works, co-hosted with Nick Capodice. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Peter. This was great.
And if you have questions about how our democracy works, you can send them in by email. The address is civics101@nhpr.org.